Okay, so I'm going to go through these topics: who funds clinical research, the choices that people make when they decide on what to research and what not to research, how funding affects the outcome of clinical research. And by the way, this is all going to be on clinical research, so the kind that involves trials in humans for new or existing drugs. Suppression and delaying of publication, the effects of conflict of interest on what people say when they get published, and finally a little bit about doctoring data, changing data around to fit preconceived ideas. So the first bit is who funds the research. This is a couple of years old, but still pretty accurate. So you can see here, this is US data. So out of 5-point-something billion, 5.5 billion or so in research, clinical research that's done in the US, biopharma and the device industry together fund by far the bulk of it. We don't have quite the same kind of data available here in Canada, but you can see down at the bottom, as you're looking at it, bottom right, that the business enterprise, and really when you're talking about health research, business enterprise is primarily the pharmaceutical industry. That's by far the single largest funder of health R&D in this country. And when you compare what the industry is spending on clinical research to what the entire budget of CIHR, you see that the industry spends more than the entire budget of the CIHR on research in Canada. So why is this important? Well, it's important because of the Willie Sutton rule. Now, anybody know who Willie Sutton is? Okay, well, that's a picture of him, at least one that I dragged up from the internet. Willie Sutton was a well-known bank robber in the 1930s. And when he got caught, he allegedly, and allegedly because some people say this was actually made up by a journalist, but he was asked, well, why do you rob banks? And his answer, that's where the money is. Okay, so keep that in mind when we look at this. Where's the money and what does the money do in terms of clinical research in the pharmaceutical industry? So, what kind of topics do you choose? I think depends on where the money is. If there's no money, people aren't going to choose topics to research. There's no point in even asking certain kinds of questions. And this is a couple of surveys that were done in the US. There isn't any comparable stuff currently in Canada. But here we're asked, how much was the choice of research topic influenced by whether or not it had commercial application? And if you got industry support, you were more than twice as likely to choose research with commercial applications than if you didn't have industry money behind you. And so that means that if essentially, when it comes to drugs, if you can't get patents on it, the questions, people are less willing to look at the questions. So for instance, take a topic, say sexually transmitted diseases amongst teenagers. So if you want to look at antibiotic treatment, chances are that somebody out there is willing to fund your research because there's money to be made in antibiotics. On the other hand, if you want to look at how to change sexual behavior of teenagers so that they don't get these diseases in the first place, well, there's no money in that. There's no patents in changing behavior. So that kind of research isn't going to get funded by the industry. And remember, who has the money? Okay, here's a practical example of this. This is looking at research into OA, osteoarthritis of the knee. And where's the money going? Well, primarily the money is going into drug research, looking at medications to help osteoarthritis. But if you actually ask both the people who are doing the research and the people who are on the receiving end of the research, so the doctors who administer the therapy, and finally the patients who take the therapies, that's not what they want. They don't want a lot more drug money or drug research. So the rheumatologists think that NSAIDs, those are non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, ibuprofen, naproxen, they think that those products are vastly over-researched and want something else. Patient groups wants conservative research into conservative therapies like physiotherapy, education, self-help. GPs think that drugs have been over-researched. They want other topics. Physiotherapists want other topics. Everybody wants other topics. But where's the money going? The money is going into drugs because drugs have patents and the companies have the money. Okay, so what happens when industry funds clinical research? This is a paper that I did. It was published in the British Medical Journal back in 2003. And what I and my colleagues did was look at a whole bunch of studies that have been done up to that point on the funding and outcomes. We combined these through meta-analysis, and the bottom line is that little diamond at the bottom of that that little diamond is the odds ratio, and the horizontal line through the diamond are the confidence intervals, so relatively narrow confidence intervals, and the 4.09 means that if research was funded by pharmaceutical companies, it was four times more likely to give a positive outcome than if research was funded by anybody else. Okay, so, I'm well known as a critic of the drug companies, and you can dismiss this. People tried, but after I did it, shortly, a couple of months later, another trial, different methodology, different data set, but essentially the same answer. In their case, the odds ratio was even higher. Okay, 2. All right, you can dismiss 2. A few more come along. A few more come along. More. More. Now, the one in red is highlighted in red because that's one that showed that there was no difference depending on the funding. More. So now we come to 2007, mid-2007, 4 years after my paper came out, and what's the score look like? Okay, so clinical trials. There have been 15 or 16 of these things published. 13 looked at clinical trials and funding source. 12 said that if industry funds it, the outcomes favor the industry. 1 says it doesn't. Pharmacoeconomic studies, 4 have looked at that. All 4 say that if the industry funds it, the outcomes favor industry. 0 for the other side. And 1 of them has looked at meta-analyses, and that found that if industry funds the meta-analyses, that the outcome favors the industry, and 0 for the other side. It's getting to look like a pretty consistent pattern. Why does this happen? Well, different people have posed different answers to this. So, use the wrong comparator. Deliberately choose a drug which is inferior. Use the wrong dose. Use a dose that's too high, and you get more side effects in the comparator. Use a dose that's too low, and the comparator isn't as effective. You just don't publish the trials with negative outcomes, especially if you want money from the same company again. Misinterpretation of results due to financial conflicts of interest. We'll see this in a little bit. Violations of uncertainty principle. So you do the study even though you think that you know what the outcome's going to be. You shouldn't be doing the study in that case. stopping trials before they're finished because it looks like they're going to have a negative outcome. This happens. It also happens for economic reasons. Companies stop trials in the middle because they change research priorities. Emphasis on secondary outcomes or subgroup analysis. So your primary, when you start a clinical trial, you have a primary question and then you have a bunch of secondary questions. You finish the trial and the answer to your primary question is negative. So when you write up the paper, you just ignore the primary question and you focus on the secondary ones, or then you start going data dredging and looking at, well, it didn't work in everybody, but if you're over 55 and you're missing your left leg, then in that group, it shows some effectiveness. And finally, you only publish some of your results, and I refer here to the class trial. This is on celecoxib or Celebrex, and I'll deal with that towards the end of this talk. Okay, so what is the state again? How do clinical researchers relate and their institutions relate to the drug companies? This is a survey recently done in the US of 107 medical schools, and there actually is some research now in Canada, but it's being written up. It hasn't been published yet, but it should be available sometime within the next year. So on some aspects, the academic institutions don't do badly when their investigators or investigators who work there are signing clinical trial agreements. So most of them don't allow the sponsor to decide whether or not the research should be published, and most of them don't allow the sponsor to make revisions in manuscripts. But other questions, the results are not as encouraging. So after the trial is over, the sponsor may prohibit the sharing of data. Well, 40% allow that. The sponsor can write up the results, and then the investigators can make changes. 50% allow that. 60% allow the sponsor to alter the study design after the agreement has been signed, and 80% allow sponsors to own the data. And if sponsors own the data, then they get to say who can use it. This is what it's like in the US in the academic centers. But the academic centers now are not where the research is being done. Okay, here's a look at the shift in where the money goes in the US over the decade 1994 to 2004. And you can see that the numbers have more than reversed. In 1994, 2/3 of the money for clinical trials was going into academic research centers. Now it's down to 1/4. And in Canada, the data isn't as good, but you see the same trend, the shifting of location. And when you shift the location, the academic centers may not be doing very well, but they're certainly going to be doing much better than the community centers, which have much less experience in research. The community doesn't have the lawyers. And in Canada and the US, the community, when trials are being done in the community, they're being run by contract research organizations, for-profit organizations that are hired by the drug companies and paid money to run the trials. Well, if you're a CRO, contract research organization, and your trial doesn't look so good at the end, is the company going to hire you again? So a lot of concerns about this shifting from a place where the controls aren't terribly good to begin with to one where they're even worse, or likely to be worse. Okay, so suppression of publication. Again, some US data, a bit old, but I think still probably pretty relevant. Question asked, Have you personally conducted any research at your university, the results of which are the property of the sponsor and cannot be published without their consent? And if you got money from the industry, your chances of answering that question positively were 5 times more than if you didn't get money from the industry. And let's look at some of the a concrete example of this. So this is this is a memo that was disclosed at a trial. Serexat, Paxil. This is one of the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This refers to trials for children. So study 329 showed trends. The second study failed to demonstrate any that Serexat, or Serexat is the UK name, Paxil was different from placebo, and therefore, bottom line, data from these 2 studies will not be submitted to the regulatory authorities. In other words, we're not going to tell people that we found that our drug doesn't work. Now, the drug was never licensed for children, but it was increasingly being used in childhood and adolescent depression. So here we have the company knows that it doesn't work, but they're not going to disclose that data. And in fact, they say so in another part of the memo. It would be commercially unacceptable to include a statement that efficacy had not been demonstrated, as this would undermine the profile of paroxetine. What about the researchers who did the research? What happened? Why didn't they speak up? Well, they didn't speak up because GlaxoSmithKline, the maker of this product, made them sign non-disclosure agreements, which meant that they could have been sued had they disclosed it. So this is a pediatric psychiatrist from Vancouver writing in the Canadian Medical Association journal after this story broke. Publications aren't only suppressed, they're also delayed. And again, if you get money from the industry, you're more likely to delay publication than if you don't get money from the industry. And one of the reasons for delaying is that your research might have something to do with trade secrets. After all, one of the things that the drug companies want to do is get patents out of their research. Patents mean trade secrets. So you'd get your research produces something that's a secret, company wants to keep. They don't want other companies to know about it and get an advantage. So they delay the publication long enough so that to ensure their commercial opportunities. When studies get published, there are also significant biases. So here's an example of that. What these people did was they got hold of all the trials on these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that were submitted to the Swedish regulatory authorities. And then they looked at, had these trials been published subsequently, after the drugs had been approved, did the trials actually appear in print? And for the ones that they did, they found some major differences between what the company submitted to the Swedish regulatory authority and what appeared in print. So first of all, not all these trials were positive, but if they were positive, they were much more likely to be standalone publications than if they weren't positive. If they weren't positive, then there would be a bunch of trials lumped into one publication. So single standalone trials are much more likely to be noticed than a bunch of trials lumped together. Second, they noticed that there was a difference in the kind of analysis that was used in the publications. So when you submit to the regulatory authority, you analyze your data using 2 forms. One is called intention to treat, which is a conservative form, and the other is called a per protocol analysis, which is a form of analysis which is much more likely to produce a positive result, or if there's a positive result, more likely to magnify that positive result. When they published the trials, only a quarter of them had the intention to treat the more conservative analysis. 75% had the per protocol analysis, the much more liberal one. And finally, if the trials were positive, they got published more than once. Why not? Okay, relationship between authors and companies. If you have, this is some data that was analyzed here in Toronto. If this was on the calcium channel blockers, a group of drugs used for high blood pressure and heart disease. If you had a relationship with the company, a financial relationship with the company making those products, 96% of the time the articles were going to be positive. If your articles were critical, only a third of the time did the authors have a financial relationship. This paper looked at studies published in the British Medical Journal, clinical trials, and ranked their conclusions on a scale of 1 to 6. And 1 essentially means we don't know whether or not this thing is any better than existing stuff. Give us more money and we'll look into the problem some more. And 6 means put it in the water, it's that good. So, and they ranked what they had to say against what the relation, did they declare their funding source. So the people who had a potential conflict of interest, in other words, the ones that were funded by for-profit organizations, were much more likely to have a higher score than people who were funded by other sources. Doctoring data. Okay, this is GlaxoSmithKline again, submitting data about the use of a drug called salmeterol, which is a long-acting product for use in asthma, and 2 ways of analyzing the data. One way, the one on the right, the confidence interval crosses 1, which means that you can't tell if it's any good. The way on the left, again, the confidence interval crosses 1, but better looking because the odds ratio is higher, or the relative risk is higher. GlaxoSmithKline, I'll leave you to guess which one they submitted initially until the results were found, until the other set of analysis was found out. I referred to the CLASS study earlier on. The CLASS study was a randomized controlled trial looking at whether or not celecoxib, Celebrex, reduced the rate of gastrointestinal bleeding compared to traditional NSAIDs like naproxen. The results as published in the Journal of the American Medical Association seem to show that. So the lower rates of GI bleeding with Celebrex looks good. What's the problem with this? Well, this is 6-month data, but the trial actually went on for a year. And by a year, there was no difference between the two. But that wouldn't look good for the company who paid for this, so that was why the 6-month data got published. Okay, Zoloft, another one of these SSRIs, and this has to do with some trials that were being done on Zoloft. Now, here again, legal lawsuits are wonderful things because you get things disclosed that you would never otherwise see. So this is, again, some data. This is about some of the trials that were done on this particular SSRI, on Zoloft. What does author TBD mean? Author to be determined. In other words, there's a company that's written up the trials, and now what they're doing is they're shopping around for people who are willing to sign the trials, prominent doctors who will sign the trials before they're submitted. And when you compare the articles that were ghost written to the ones that weren't, The ones that were ghostwritten got cited more often, appeared in more prominent journals than the ones that weren't ghostwritten. So what we have here is a corruption of what ends up in the literature, because the data that's written by a company that's paid to write up the study gets cited more often than the real data, than the others. So, bottom line, follow the money. Willie Sutton. Different funders have different interests. Those interests determine what kind of research gets done, what kind of biases are there, what the outcomes are, and how these outcomes are reported. And right now, the money is with the pharmaceutical companies. Thanks very much.